So we're going to start our study of ecology with the idea of behavior. And it says here that behavior is basically how an organism copes with its environment. Remember that we kind of said that behavior is how an organism is going to respond to stimuli. You know, we're going to talk about the tropisms and food response and those kind of things. That's in general what behavior does, and the behavior is going to kind of govern the ecology in terms of the society and the hierarchy, etc. So we start off with the first behavior, which is instinct here. Instinct is inborn, unlearned. We used a couple times the term innate for behavior. It is stuff that organisms, animals in particular, do without having to be taught. We talked about innate things like when the ducks follow their mom. Innate things are kind of helping us to survive infancy. For example, when turtles hatch, they have an innate need to go to the sea without being taught that or shown that because mom isn't around to show them. So it says here, instinct is the inherited circuitry that directs and guides behavior. I would say that instinct is kind of your first survival. Instinct is what's going to allow you to survive and keep growing and contributing to the environment and your population. Okay, the next topic is the idea of fixed action patterns. So this is not, like it says in this paragraph, it's not a reflex. So it's not, blinking. It's not removing your hand from something hot. But it is also not conscious. So it's not something that the organism is going to think about. It's kind of I would say a programmed, that would be the word I would use, behavior. This example here, if you want to read it, talks about a duck with an egg. You see this a lot, this fixed action pattern in zoos. So animals that are in zoos no longer hunt, but sometimes they will have stalking behavior, so they're kind of not stalking anything, but they still stalk. And zoos are starting to really look at this and try to give them things, they call it enrichment, that would help the animal continue this fixed action pattern so they're not just kind of doing something for no purpose. The next thing is learning. We used to think, humans were the only ones that learn, and now we know that lots of animals learn in lots of different ways. Learning is any time that you're getting a change in behavior or you're doing something new because of an experience that you had. You can learn from a parent. You can learn simply by you did something and it didn't work. So, for example, we talked about 2-year-olds run around like crazy. They hit a table once and they kind of learn that you need to be careful and not maybe run as fast when there's objects in the way. Types of learning, imprinting. Imprinting is the idea that you're going to follow mom. The thing we always talk about with imprinting is the ducklings, right? They're going to follow mom wherever she goes, and that's going to help their survival because they're going to learn from mom. They're going to be protected by mom, and that is a real key. They imprint on the first maternal figure, so it's not always mom. That's the famous photo of Lorenz with the ducklings following him. They do say that imprinting has to happen during a critical period, which is the window when the animal is most likely to bond. Usually that's when, they're very young. Some argue that humans have a critical period where they bond with their parents, and if they don't have anybody to bond to, that's where you hear these horrible stories of children in orphanages. They don't bond with any adult during their critical period, so then they pretty much cannot bond with anyone their whole life. So we say imprinting is a form of learning that occurs during a brief period of time, usually very early in the organism's life. And then we get into the two types of, if you're going to take a psychology course, these are huge. Classical conditioning is the first one. So classical conditioning is the idea that you're going to associate a behavior with something that is an outside source. So the example here says if you have a dog or cat, you know that every time you hit the electric can opener, they come running. This is the classic Pavlov's dog. scenario where, he conditioned them to have every time a bell rang, they got fed, so they began to salivate every time a bell was rung. So the behavior is separate from the stimuli. So the bell has nothing to do with food, but then the dogs learn to associate that with food, which is where you get the associative learning. Again, the example of the dogs, animals sometimes do this where they associate sometimes humans with danger, and they run away. So any kind of associative learning is when you attach a behavior to a non-related stimuli. So besides classical, you have operant conditioning. In operant conditioning, they also call it trial and error learning. This is where you're associating a behavior with a reward or punishment. So this is the classic rat hitting the lever experiment, where sometimes they hit the lever and they get food, sometimes they hit the lever and get a shock, and they kind of learn to associate that lever with one of those two rewards or punishments. So it says in operant conditioning, the animal's behavior determines whether it gets a reward or punishment. Classical conditioning is just learned association of two things. Habituation is the last form of learning that we didn't really talk too much about, but this is basically when an animal learns not to respond to a stimulus. So this is where they become so used to the stimulus that it no longer warrants a response. So, for example, if an animal encounters a stimulus over and over, the response will gradually lessen. You do this sometimes with your alarm clock. So, your alarm clock, you can become habituated to the sound, and all of a sudden, you've hit snooze 5 times and you're late. So, I am someone who definitely gets habituated to my alarm clock. I set multiple alarms, and then sometimes I find myself in the middle of the year having to change the sound. Sometimes if you're having trouble, change the sound on your phone that plays, and that will kind of disengage that habituation, and you will wake up. So then it just recaps the 4 types of learning: imprinting, classical conditioning, and operant conditioning. I guess you can consider habituation there as well. We've talked a lot about circadian rhythm, which is just, again, an internal alarm clock. All species we have found have circadian rhythm. This can be night and day cycles. This can be year cycles. This can be seasonal cycles. They all kind of help dictate an animal's behavior. We talk about this with hibernation, and certain animals are nocturnal, so certain animals are diurnal. So a lot of the world is controlled by these circadian rhythms. We talked about reproduction. Most animals reproduce in the spring, and you'll see little babies running around and those kind of things. So we said animals communicate with basically the sense signals. So it's chemical, visual, electrical, or tactile. So the chemical would be pheromones, signaling. Usually you associate pheromones with reproduction. So a female can signal a male that she is in heat, is what we call it. She is ready to reproduce. They say the other example again is the ants leave a little line, the trail, so they can find their way home. Visual things is the real fun, flashy displays. So all the bird dances and the displays, the mating displays, that's visually trying to entice a mate. You do get some electrical things. This is mostly fish. So they have the nodes of Ranvier in the front. I'm sorry, that's the neuron. They have the nodes in the front there that do, if you've ever seen the front of the shark, they have the little dimples. That's where they're getting electrical signals. And then tactile obviously is touch. So simple as humans hugging or cuddling can communicate. The example I gave you is the little ant or the bee that taps its mate on the head to kind of say, hey, I'm ready to mate. So there's lots of different types of signals, and they kind of cause lots of different types of responses depending on the goal. Social behavior is when species live in social groups. Not all species, remember, live in social groups. So if a species is a loner type species, remember we talked about tigers are pretty much loners. Otherwise, when they do live in a group, there's usually social behavior that has to be learned, and you learn from other members of the group. So these behaviors include Agonistic, I always think of antagonistic. This is aggressive behavior over food, usually resources, usually males. But that's just, aggression, displays of aggression. So if you want to think about, the gorilla hitting its chest, those are all displays like that. Dominance hierarchy or pecking order. We talked a lot about this with lions. There's definitely a male dominant lion, and there's also usually that happening with the females. There's like a pecking order to who gets food, a pecking order to who gets to mate with the male, and that is all kind of figured out within the social structure. Territoriality is really with wolves. We've talked about that a lot. Wolves really like to have their territory to themselves and not have anybody come in. We remember that wolves mark this territory with their urine, peeing on trees. So if your dog ever, seems to go to the same tree over and over and pee on it, it's probably because another dog's peeing on it and they're fighting over the neighborhood territory. And then altruistic behavior is something that we don't expect to see in a lot of animal groups, but sometimes we do. This is the idea of unselfish behavior. And this really stumped scientists for a while, because why would an animal kind of put its own survival at risk? Why would it do that? That kind of goes against laws of nature. And we figured out altruistic behavior has two things. One, it helps the survival of the species. So, if your sacrifice is going to help your pride survive, everybody, the group over the individual, that is a reason they would do it. And the other reason is sometimes they say it can up your social standing. So if you're willing to sacrifice yourself and save the group, then they'll kind of all say, well, maybe this guy can be higher in the pecking order. So symbiotic relationships, we kind of use that as the general term. Symbiotic is just two things interacting with each other. The three types are in this book. Again, that's kind of what we're saying you have to know. Is mutualism. That's where they both benefit. So remember, this is usually shown with the plus idea. Commensalism is where one organism lives off another with no harm. So you would have the plus negative. And parasitism is where the organism actually harms the host, and that would be negative. You are very likely to see that on the exam. Very likely to see that idea of plus, minus, plus 0. So I would know some examples. So, here the lichen with mutualism. Commensalism is, we talked a lot about the little birds that sit on top of the animals in the plains of Africa. And then parasitism, a tick is a parasite. Just make sure you have some examples there for those. Plant behaviors mainly have to do with photoperiodism, because plants really kind of depend on light for our friend photosynthesis. So plants really have developed strong responses to light. We talked about CAM plants and C4 plants, and we've talked a lot about, a plant is going to move to find the light. So plants really, really depend on those phototropic behaviors. A tropism is a turning in response to a stimulus. So a tropism, in general, you can say it's a reaction, but we more specifically, especially when we talk about plants, it's the idea of movement towards a stimulus. So phototropism is obviously light. Gravitropism is obviously gravity, and we've talked about that before as well, where if you took a potted plant, put it on its edge, the plant would actually make a turn and grow up towards the sky instead of, horizontally. So don't forget about the touch up here. Thigmotropism is a response to touch, and it's giving you the example of the ivy. I gave you the example of the plant that you brush it and it closes up. So those are just thigmotrophic. Next we have the kind of organization. Remember that this goes from big to small. So if you want to think like that, this is the big, this is the small. So biosphere is the whole planet, and then in here you would actually have probably biomes. And then ecosystem, community, population, species. There's that little king, a little phrase to help you remember that. The biosphere is divided into large regions called biomes. If you recall, we did biome projects. But remember, I told you that really what you have to know, there's a lot of biomes, but to the extent that you have to understand that if an organism is in that biome, what is that behavior or what is that evolution going to look like? So really, if you just know a desert from a tropical rainforest, from where we live, the deciduous forest, from the Arctic, those are just kind of the way you need to know the difference in terms of rain, animals that live there. So you probably know that. So if you just kind of want to maybe remind yourself of like the taiga, but really, you just kind of need to have a general idea of what that looks like. If you remember, I told you the easiest way is to think in your head an example of a place like that. So, for example, we live in the temperate forest. That kind of gives you an idea. The tropics would be any island, the Bahamas, something like that, just to give you an idea of what that looks like. Remember, ecosystems have biotic and abiotic factors. And the difference there would be biotic is anything that is living. So this includes plants, animals, bacteria, fungi, anything like that. And abiotic would be non-living. That's anything weather related, rainfall, temperature, air quality. That's all the non-living parts of an ecosystem. Next, it talks about the carbon cycle. If you recall, we actually did a couple. We did the water, the nitrogen, the phosphorus. Again, this book only has the carbon, so to me that would mean that's the only one they're really concerned with. With carbon, it's mainly we talk about CO2. You start with the whole idea of photosynthesis and respiration, just kind of continually recycle the carbon. So you see there the photosynthesis and respiration. That's just plants taking it in, breathing it out, organisms taking it in, breathing it out. The other parts are kind of the parts that we're worried about. So carbon, the big one is the fossil fuels. Not so much the formation. This is, dead and dying things kind of recycle the carbon in that way that they go back into the earth, and then it fuels the new plants, the whole Simba, we become the grass and the antelopes eat the grass, those kind of things. What we really, really, and I'll do this in red, the problem here is these. That the burning of fossil fuels is adding more carbon than all of the other things combined. We'll use blue here. Carbon does go in and out of the ocean. That's a natural thing, carbon moving in and out of the ocean, but because we're having a ton of extra carbon in the air from fossil fuels, notice it's only going one direction, whereas the photosynthesis and respiration kind of goes down, up. This one's only going up, and that's where we get the whole idea of our global warming issue. This is the problem. All of this is natural. All of this would happen anyway, but this is creating excess of carbon beyond what is naturally supposed to be there. And then we have the debate. Is that causing the planet to warm up quicker than it's supposed to? And again, I digress on that issue. And then the idea that it does go in and out of the ocean, but because of this, we're getting an excess of this, which is causing, remember, CO2 is related to acid, and we're causing acidification. When we talk about a community is a group of interacting plants and animals that show some degree of interdependence. So a community is, in general, all the living things. So remember that each organism has its own niche. Niche is the job. So usually there is one organism that occupies one niche. If an organism comes in and tries to occupy that niche, there usually is a competition. That's the invasive species issue. If one species has its niche and another species is trying to come in there, that could be a problem. The other way that this works is the idea of a food chain or a food web. And we're going to look at that in a second. So the basic part of the food web is these three parts here. We start with the producers, the autotrophs. They make their own food using photosynthesis. We call that, the terms of productivity. So primary productivity or gross productivity. That's how much food generally is available. So again, autotrophs produce their own food. Without autotrophs, the entire system breaks down. Consumers, heterotrophs, are anything that must eat another organism. So you can be a omnivore, a vegetarian, but you're still a heterotroph because you're eating something else. You cannot make your own food. So primary consumers are organisms that feed on the producers, so they're eating, usually they're vegetarian. We call them herbivores. And then the secondary consumers eat the primary consumers, tertiary eat with the primary, and so on and so forth. Decomposers kind of are a little bit of an offshoot. They usually kind of hang out over here. They digest and recycle the dead and dying material. So, when all of these things die and start to go away, the decomposers come in and save the day. So now we're going to look at the gross parent productivity, primary productivity thing. Okay, so these primary productivity problems I think are a little bit easier than you're kind of making a little bit more complicated. There is a more complicated version if you remember with taking, gaseous carbon dioxide, turning it to fixed carbon. That you're not likely to see. We can go over that in class on Friday if you would like. So what we have here is a problem that I got right from one of your worksheets. And it says the net annual primary productivity of a particular wetland ecosystem is said to be 8,000 kilocalories per meter squared. So what that's saying is that's basically how many plants are there for somebody to eat. If the respiration by aquatic producers is 12,000 kilocalories per meter squared, what is the gross annual primary productivity per year? So when you see a problem like this, do what I did, highlight, underline, and then always write what you have. So the net annual primary productivity is written with doing NPP. So the net primary productivity is 8,000 kilocalories, which is an energy unit, per meter square, which is an area unit. And then it says the respiration rate is 12,000 kilocalories per meter squared. So that's how much carbon's being transpired. And then it's asking for the GPP. Don't get super hung up on these units. As long as they're the same, that's really all you have to care about, and they should be the same. So if I go up to this equation here, all I have to simply do is put 8,000, which is your NPP. I'm solving for GPP. I can put X there if I want. And then I'm just simply subtracting the respiration rate. And then I would, remember with your math, you would add 12,000 and 8,000. So you get your gross primary productivity as 20,000. And the unit's just going to be the same, kilocalories per meter squared. So remember, what this is asking you is gross primary productivity is the total amount of plants available. And then what you do is take away how much respiration those plants go through, and that gives you the net. Kind of like a bank account, your gross income, and then you take all your taxes out, and that's how much actually appears in your bank account. Okay, the top here just kind of gives you some general characteristics of a food web. The idea that producers make their own food, primary consumers eat the plants, secondary consumers, etc. The idea of a keystone species is kind of the most important species, the one that if that leaves the ecosystem, what would happen? Expect maybe perhaps a question where they give you a food web and they say, this is what happened. All of these animals disappeared. Try to figure out what the keystone species is. And then that's the one that has the biggest impact on the rest of the food pyramid, the food web. And then the biggie here is the 10% rule here. This is what keeps food chains to maybe tertiary or maybe a quaternary consumer, no more. This is what keeps, animals to a size that they are. This is what governs how animals eat. So it's the idea that only 10% of the energy is going up each level. So when you talk about the primary consumers eating the producers, they're only getting 10% of that energy. 90% is lost as heat. And each level above that, again, it's 10% of the previous level. So the one that we did, the examples, we kind of put numbers to this, if you remember, and we said, okay, if this starts off with 20,000 calories, then when it gets to here, now it's only down to 2,000, and then it's down to 200, and then it's down to 20, etc. and so forth. So this has applications with, why there's usually more, primary consumers than there are predators. why, there's only a certain, maybe 15 lions in a big, huge area of the plains where there's tons of things for them to eat, because there's only 10% of that energy being transferred. It's why lions are the top of the pride, because they're you can't keep going up, because once you get 10% of something very small, it's not even worth hunting. So this explains a lot of that eating structure and feeding structure. And if they ask you to explain that, usually it's the 10% rule. So the, poetic nature, I guess, of the world is, even though you're only getting 10% of the energy, if you have toxins in that food, the toxins don't deplete, they actually build up. So I think we talked about in class, this is one of the reasons why an example of this would be mercury in fish. So why we say you're not supposed to eat a ton of tuna, because the mercury will, build up in the tuna, and then you're getting a bigger dose. This particular section here is talking about the idea of this insecticide DDT and how it almost killed off the ospreys, because every time you go up the food pyramid, you're actually concentrating and concentrating and concentrating these toxins. And again, that's kind of, we figured out the DDT, we figured out there was a problem, we stopped using it, and then the ospreys actually bounce back. We say that nature is a balance of, ecosystem and abiotic and biotic factors, and things all the time can come in and disrupt that balance. They could be geological changes, earthquakes, tornadoes, floods, dust bowls, those kind of things. And usually what happens is the environment will change, the organisms will change, but usually a homeostasis again is reached. Just kind of like your body. Stuff will happen, big changes will happen, and the animals will then have to respond. So when we talk about population ecology, we have to talk about how many are surviving. So we talk about births and deaths. This graph is going to be big, the survivorship curve. They're probably going to ask you to read it. There's a lot of things you can see from this graph. So for example, humans are, in this particular graph, logistic, and they're K selected. And oysters are, more R selected. If you recall all those things, a lot of babies at the beginning, not a lot of adults. There is some math. So just simply the rate, which is births minus deaths over N. N is always, remember, the original population. So how many species there were at the beginning. And then we get change in population size over change in time is births minus deaths. And there's some other equations on the equation sheet that you want to familiarize yourself with. Remember, just quite simply though, don't forget the basics. If there's more births than deaths, the population will go up. So if there's a greater number of births, the population will go up. If there's a greater number of deaths, the population will go down. If births about equal deaths, that's where you get the stable environment. Carrying capacity, that's the letter K we use. That's the idea that an environment can only support a certain number of individuals. There just isn't enough land, there isn't enough food, there isn't enough resources. And the carrying capacity is like that limit. And once a organism either hits the carrying capacity or overshoots it, then the environment kind of starts to fight back. And remember, we talked about that with humans. Have we reached that? Are we getting ready for a decline? We're not quite sure. Population density. Population, remember, is just number of individuals in a given area. So just literally how many. Then there's factors that are either density independent, or we're going to talk about density dependent. And quite simply is this factor, does it matter how many individuals are there? So something, for example, like rainfall, that is density independent. It does not matter how many people are there, the rain is the rain. But something like food availability, that's density dependent. If there's more organisms, there's less food. So there's two types of growth. Exponential is where you just increase and increase and increase with really no check. But usually, remember, what happens is you get exponential growth for a while, and then usually it changes over to logistic growth. So some scientists argue that logistic or exponential growth hasn't reached its logistic growth yet. That really everything has a carrying capacity. It's just a matter of in our perspective where that organism is. So right here, notice, is the carrying capacity. That's the limit. And then usually a organism would go logistic from there. So here we see logistic growth. Logistic growth kind of goes around the whole idea of a K, a carrying capacity. Remember, logistic growth is going to look like an S curve like that. R strategies and K strategies are reproductive strategies. So remember, R strategies where you have lots of babies. So you have a high number of babies, but you have low survival. So that's the idea where you're going to have a whole lot of babies and you're going to hope maybe 20% survive. Where K selection is low number of babies and you get high survival. So you're going to have, one or two children and you're going to care for them and most of them are going to reach adulthood. One is not better than the other. It kind of just depends on the organism and the way the organism works. All right. Ecological succession is the idea that if you wipe out something, how quick does it come back? So remember, we have primary succession and we have secondary as well. So it says the process of ecological succession in which no previous organisms have existed is called primary succession. If you remember, primary is where you start with rock only, no plants. And secondary is where you start with some low grasses. And then remember the picture where, then you go to small bushes and then larger bushes and then small trees and then large trees. But the term succession is where you're starting. A pioneer organism is kind of the first one to be there in that area. Sometimes a primary organism can be an invasive species, something that comes in and just happens to survive, and kind of depending on how you look at it, we may think it's bad, but we may think, hey, I'm surviving in this area. So here you see the succession here, if you remember. This would be here. This is primary succession because you're starting with mineral. There's no grasses. So secondary succession would just start right there. But again, you're going to get, mineral, in this case, low grasses, shrubs, small trees, big trees, and then you get, the whole environment back. Now, they do mention specific types of environmental impacts, human impacts on the environment. This may be a free response. They mention specific ones here. I have talked to you about these in class. I would just kind of maybe put them in your back pocket as examples. Examples of where, humans are impacting the normal feedback and the normal stimuli and the normal behavior of animals. So the first one is greenhouse gases. We've talked a lot about that. I just mentioned that before. Our burning of fossil fuels is putting more CO2 than is supposed to be there, that would normally be there. Ozone depletion, the ozone keeps out UV radiation and we're poking holes in it. And what effect is that going to have? Acid rain. So this is the one, remember, you're not going to get burned and your skin's not going to melt from acid rain, but it does affect small lakes and streams. Their pH can become too high. It affects trees. And that is just total, our emissions, our plants and our cars is causing acid rain. And then we have desertification, which is exactly what it sounds like. We are overgrazing, over-farming, and creating desert land when there once was good soil. Deforestation's a no duh. We are clearing land, clearing trees. Mostly, people may not know, we clear most trees to farm. So some people think, you're clearing trees to make paper. Nope. Most tree clearing is happening actually in South America and the Amazon, and it's to make farms to feed people. Obviously, trees are very important, oxygen and the like, so that's a big problem. Pollution, just kind of, they say in general, is bad. Us taking chemicals that we make and dumping them to the environment is never a good idea because they're not natural. And this also talks about the idea of biomagnification, which concentrates those chemicals. And then we did talk about, bioaugmentation in ways now we're trying to fight back with that. And then finally, reduction in biodiversity. We are causing species to become endangered and extinct. The main culprit is habitat loss. That is why that is happening, because we need more places to put people. And if we start reducing the number of species, how is that going to affect our food pyramid? How is that going to affect all these population dynamics? So again, with that section with those human impacts, I would just have them in your back pocket. They may say like discuss 3 human impacts, and so I would just kind of know them to that extent.